Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard the story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1933. America was still reeling from the Great Depression. Banks had closed. Family fortunes had evaporated overnight. And in the rugged terrain of the Missouri Ozarks, land was cheap for those who still had some money tucked away. The dense forests and isolated valleys of this region had long harbored secrets, some natural, some man-made, some better left undisturbed. This particular story begins with a parcel of land that seemed, to the untrained eye, utterly unremarkable. Harrison and Howard Sinclair, identical twins in their early 40s, had managed to hold onto a modest inheritance left by their maternal grandfather. The brothers were tall, lean men with prematurely silver hair and the weathered complexions of those accustomed to outdoor work. They were unusual men, bachelor brothers who had never lived apart, with a keen interest in agriculture and self-sufficiency that predated the economic collapse. When they discovered a 5-acre plot of land for sale at a price that seemed too good to be true, they didn't hesitate. The property was located in Miller County, near the small settlement of Iberia, sparsely populated even by Ozark standards, with fewer than 300 residents scattered across the surrounding hills and hollers. What made the price so appealing was the property's history, or rather, the local perception of it. According to county records, the land had belonged to the Everdale family for generations before being seized for unpaid taxes in 1928. It had remained unclaimed for 5 years, with no interested buyers until the Sinclairs arrived from Springfield, where they had previously operated a small plant nursery business that had failed in the economic downturn. The brothers arrived on a crisp autumn day to inspect their purchase. The land featured a natural clearing surrounded by dense oak and hickory forest, with a small creek running through the western edge. There were no structures, just overgrown fields, and the stone foundations of what might have once been a cabin or outbuilding. A rutted dirt track led from the county road to the clearing, barely passable even in the Sinclair's sturdy Model A Ford. What struck the Sinclair twins as odd was the reaction of locals when they mentioned their new acquisition. Conversations would abruptly halt. Eye contact would be broken. In the general store, the elderly proprietor, Marguerite Porter, a woman with a face as creased and weathered as old leather, simply shook her head and muttered, "Some ground ain't meant for tilling." When Harrison politely asked her to elaborate, she busied herself with rearranging items on the shelves and changed the subject to the likelihood of an early frost. The twins encountered similar reactions at the county courthouse, where they had gone to ensure their deed was properly recorded. The clerk, Ezekiel Thornton, a thin, nervous man with spectacles that constantly slid down his nose, became visibly uncomfortable when they mentioned the location of their property. "The old Everdale place," he said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Hasn't been anyone out there since. Well, must be 50 years or more." When Howard pressed him for details, Thornton merely adjusted his spectacles and said something vague about the soil being poor for farming, a claim that contradicted what the brothers had observed during their inspection, where they had noted rich, dark earth in the clearing. But the brothers were practical men who had little patience for what they considered backwoods superstition. They pitched tents on their property and began planning where to build their homestead and which fields to clear first. Harrison, the more meticulous of the two, created detailed maps and soil testing records in a leather-bound notebook. Howard kept a daily journal of their progress and observations, writing by lantern light each evening. On their third day on the property, while marking boundaries for their planned cabin, Harrison's spade struck something solid about 18 inches below the surface. Thinking it was just another rock, The Ozarks being notorious for their rocky soil, he continued to dig around it. What emerged wasn't a rock, but a metal box, roughly the size of a bread loaf, corroded but intact. The box was made of copper, now green with age and soil acids. It had been sealed with some kind of resin or wax, which had protected its contents from moisture. A small lock had once secured it, but the mechanism had long since deteriorated. According to Howard's journal, found years later, they opened the box that evening by their campfire. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages warped by moisture, but largely legible, along with several daguerreotype photographs, a pocket watch that had stopped at 3:17, and what appeared to be a collection of human teeth. The journal belonged to Dr. Ambrose Everdale, dated from 1872 to 1874. The first page identified him as a graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, who had returned to his family property to establish a country practice. Dr. Everdale's handwriting was precise and elegant, betraying his education and refinement, qualities that must have made him something of an anomaly in the isolated Ozarks of the post-Civil War era. His writings began as the mundane observations of a country doctor, noting the common ailments of rural folk: influenza, broken bones, difficult births. But by early 1873, the entries took a disturbing turn. Dr. Everdale had become fascinated by what he called the architecture of pain, how the human body and mind respond to various forms of distress. His writings suggested that he had begun to conduct experiments, though the details were mercifully vague. What was clear was his growing obsession with the concept of sympathetic suffering, particularly in individuals with profound connections, such as twins. The phenomenon of shared sensation between identical subjects represents the most promising avenue for understanding the true nature of consciousness, Everdale wrote in March 1873. If two beings can experience the same pain, the same pleasure, without direct physical stimulus, then consciousness itself must transcend the merely physical realm. The daguerreotypes showed what appeared to be various individuals in states of distress, their faces obscured or turned away from the camera. The photographs had the clinical quality of medical documentation rather than portraiture. One photograph, however, clearly showed two young men, identical in appearance, seated side by side, their expressions vacant. Their hands resting palm up on a table before them. Each palm appeared to have a dark mark at its center. On the back of this particular photograph, written in the same precise hand as the journal, was a single sentence: "The circuit is established." According to Howard's journal, he and Harrison spent hours that night reading Dr. Everdale's journal by firelight, their initial fascination giving way to unease. Howard wrote, "H suggests we should report our find to the authorities. But what crime has been documented here? The writings of a man long dead conducting what appear to be unusual, but not necessarily illegal medical studies. And yet there is something in these pages that disturbs us both deeply." The brothers slept poorly that night. Howard's journal entry the following morning notes that they both experienced remarkably similar dreams, of being observed by an unseen presence, of hands reaching toward them from darkness. They decided to continue with their plans for the property, storing the box and its contents in Harrison's trunk. Howard wrote, "What proof have we of any wrongdoing? Ancient rumors and a doctor's strange preoccupations? We came here to build, not to dig up old troubles." That decision would prove fatal. In the days that followed, the brothers began clearing land for their cabin. They worked well together with the seamless coordination that people often remarked upon in identical twins. Harrison would often start a sentence that Howard would finish, or one would hand the other a tool just as it was needed without a word being spoken. This natural synchronicity had always been a point of pride for them, proof of their special connection. But according to Howard's increasingly troubled journal entries, strange phenomena began to manifest on the property. Tools left in one location would be found in another by morning. The sounds of digging could be heard at night, though neither brother admitted to leaving their tent. On several occasions they both woke simultaneously from sleep, certain they had heard someone calling their names. Most disturbing were the dreams they both began to experience, dreams of being watched by someone just out of sight, of hands reaching up from the soil. Howard described one particularly vivid nightmare. I was lying on my back, unable to move. Above me stood a figure in dark clothing, leaning over me. I could not see his face, only his hands, which were extraordinarily pale, almost luminous in the darkness. He reached down and placed his palm against mine, and I felt a burning sensation, as if he were pressing a hot coal into my flesh. The pain was excruciating, yet I could not cry out. Harrison reported an identical dream the same night. On October 17th, Harrison developed a peculiar mark on his right palm, a perfect circle about the size of a dime, reddened as if burned. He attributed it to a possible chemical burn from the lye soap they used, though he couldn't recall any specific incident that might have caused it. 3 days later, Howard discovered an identical mark on his own palm, in precisely the same location. Local resident Ephraim Yates later testified that the brothers came into town that day, seeking medical attention from Dr. Wilson, the county's only physician. Dr. Wilson's records, preserved in the county archives, describe the marks as consistent with chemical burn or prolonged pressure from a circular object, but could offer no explanation for their identical nature and location. He prescribed a simple poultice of witch hazel and suggested they wear gloves while working to prevent further irritation. The brothers purchased supplies to last several weeks, telling the general store owner they planned to finish their cabin before winter set in. That was the last time anyone in town reported seeing the Sinclair twins alive. What happened over the next 2 weeks can only be reconstructed from Howard's journal, which becomes increasingly erratic and difficult to follow. The handwriting deteriorates from his usually neat penmanship to a sprawling, sometimes barely legible scrawl. Entries are occasionally dated incorrectly or dated multiple times, suggesting the writer was losing track of time. He describes Harrison's declining mental state, how his brother became convinced that something was buried on their property that needed to remain hidden. Harrison reportedly spent nights digging in various locations only to fill the holes before dawn. When Howard questioned him about these activities, Harrison claimed he couldn't remember doing any digging. "He looks at me sometimes as if I'm a stranger," Howard wrote on October 25th. "Yesterday he called me Ambrose, then seemed confused when I corrected him. The mark on his palm has begun to spread, the skin around it reddened and inflamed. He won't let me examine it closely." Howard documented his own deteriorating condition as well. The circular mark on his palm had begun to throb in sync with his heartbeat. He experienced moments of lost time, coming to awareness in different locations on the property with no memory of how he got there. Most disturbingly, he wrote of waking to find his brother standing over him, watching him sleep only to discover Harrison still in his own bed the next morning. "I don't know which of us is wandering at night," he wrote. "Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. I can no longer trust my own perceptions." By late October, the brothers' construction project had stalled completely. The foundation for their cabin remained half-finished, tools lying where they had been dropped. According to Howard's journal, they spent increasingly long periods sitting in silence, staring at the spot where Harrison had unearthed the metal box. "There is something else buried here," Howard wrote on October 30th. "H feels it too. We can sense it somehow through our hands, through these marks that won't heal. Something calling to us from below the surface." On November 1st, Howard reports that Harrison began to dig again, this time in the center of the clearing. Howard joined him, though his journal doesn't clarify whether this was voluntary or compelled. They dug through the day and into the night, illuminated by their lantern. "We found nothing," Howard wrote. "Just soil and more soil, yet H is convinced we're close." He places his hands on the ground and closes his eyes as if listening. Sometimes he speaks, but not to me. He says the names of people I don't know. Pairs of names. Always pairs. The final dated entry in Howard's journal is from November 3, 1933. It reads simply, "The ground speaks to him now. He listens with his hands pressed to the soil. I fear what it's telling him, what it's telling us both." There is one more entry, undated, written in a hand so shaky as to be almost indecipherable. "We understand now. The circuit must be completed, back to back, hand in hand. As they sat, so shall we. The doctor will attend us both." 2 weeks later, when the brothers failed to appear in town for needed supplies, Sheriff Cyrus Monroe rode out to check on them. What he found was documented in his official report, filed November 19, 1933. The cabin foundation had been completed, but construction had evidently halted. The brothers' tent contained their belongings, undisturbed. Their cooking equipment showed signs of recent use. Ashes in the fire pit were relatively fresh, and unwashed plates remained beside it. But there was no sign of the Sinclairs themselves. Near the creek, the sheriff discovered a series of shallow excavations, over a dozen in total. Some appeared to have been recently refilled, the soil still loose on top. Most disturbing was what he found in the center of the clearing, a perfectly circular area approximately 8 feet in diameter, where the ground had been meticulously cleared of all vegetation, the soil tamped down and smooth. Sheriff Monroe, a pragmatic man with little patience for the superstitions that still held sway in the remote areas of the county, initially suspected foul play, perhaps a robbery gone wrong, or an old feud that had followed the brothers from their previous home. He organized a search of the surrounding forest, believing the twins might have been injured or killed, and their bodies concealed. A broader search was organized, with men from Iberia and neighboring settlements combing the woods and dragging the creek. Dogs were brought in to track any scent. According to newspaper accounts from the time, the search dogs exhibited strange behavior, circling the property but refusing to enter certain areas, particularly the clearing where the brothers had planned to build their cabin. When physically led into these areas, the animals would whine and pull at their leashes, attempting to retreat. No evidence of the brothers was found during the initial search. Sheriff Monroe filed a missing persons report and continued periodic checks of the property through the winter months. But as the weather grew colder and snow blanketed the region, the investigation effectively stalled. It wasn't until spring of 1934 that the first physical evidence emerged. A severe storm caused significant flooding along the creek, eroding several feet of the bank. A local trapper discovered what he initially thought was an animal bone protruding from the newly exposed soil. Closer examination revealed a human radius, a forearm bone. The subsequent excavation, overseen by Sheriff Monroe and documented by County Coroner Wilfred Pearson, uncovered the partial remains of what appeared to be 2 adult males. The bodies had been buried approximately 4 feet below the surface, in a seated position, back to back. Most disturbing was the state of the remains. The hands of both men had been surgically removed at the wrists. Coroner Pearson's report, preserved in the county archives, describes the scene in clinical detail. The subjects appear to be adult males of similar height and build, approximately 40-50 years of age. Decomposition is consistent with death occurring 4 to 6 months prior to discovery. The remains were positioned in a seated posture, spinal columns aligned and in contact. The radius and ulna of both arms on both subjects terminate abruptly at the distal end, with evidence of precise transection approximately 1 inch proximal to the wrist joint. dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Harrison and Howard Sinclair. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as exsanguination due to the removal of the hands, though it was noted that the procedure appeared to have been performed with medical precision. The amputation sites showed evidence of sutures and rudimentary bandaging, suggesting the victims had been alive for some time after the procedure. What perplexed investigators was the apparent lack of a struggle. There were no signs of restraints on the remains, no evidence of other injuries. It was as if the brothers had simply sat down together and allowed this to happen. Even more puzzling was the absence of the severed hands. Despite an extensive search of the area, these remains were never found. Howard's journal was found among their belongings, along with Dr. Everdale's journal and the other items from the metal box. Sheriff Monroe, after reviewing the materials, made a curious decision. Rather than entering them as evidence, he reportedly delivered them to Marguerite Porter, the elderly shopkeeper who had warned the brothers about the land. According to a statement given by Porter's granddaughter in 1962, the old woman wasn't surprised when the sheriff arrived with the journals. "Some places remember," she reportedly told him, "and what happened there with the doctor and those poor souls back in '73. That land won't forget." Porter apparently revealed that local lore held that Dr. Ambrose Everdale had been conducting grotesque experiments focused on twins, based on his belief that identical siblings shared a metaphysical connection that transcended ordinary human consciousness. His experiments had allegedly culminated in the systematic amputation of his subjects' hands, which he believed were the physical conduit for their shared identity. According to this account, when locals discovered what Everdale had been doing, they took matters into their own hands. The doctor disappeared in late 1874, and his property was quietly divided and sold off to non-locals. The area where his experiments supposedly took place, the clearing where the Sinclair twins had planned to build, was left untouched, unmarked, and unspoken of. Until 1933, when two identical brothers unwittingly purchased the very ground where these horrors had occurred. Sheriff Monroe's official report makes no mention of Everdale or his experiments. It concludes simply that the Sinclair brothers met with foul play at the hands of person or persons unknown, possibly transients passing through the area. The case was never officially solved. In the aftermath of the Sinclair case, the property was once again seized by the county. Records show it was designated as conservation land in 1939, effectively preventing future development. The official reason cited was watershed protection, but local residents understood the real purpose. The story might have ended there, forgotten except in local whispers, had it not been for an academic's curiosity 2 decades later. In 1956, history professor Claudia Reynolds from the University of Missouri began researching the case as part of a broader study on folklore and collective memory in isolated communities. Her work brought her to Iberia, where she discovered that residents still avoided the former Everdale property. Even the conservation designation hadn't changed local attitudes toward the land. Reynolds, a tall, austere woman with a reputation for methodical research and skepticism toward supernatural explanations, approached the case with academic detachment. She believed the persistent avoidance of the property represented a sociological phenomenon, how communities create and maintain taboos around locations associated with traumatic events. Reynolds conducted interviews with elderly residents who remembered the Sinclair case, as well as those who claimed to know the oral history of Dr. Everdale's activities. She was particularly interested in how the story had evolved over time, and whether there was any factual basis for the more sensational elements. One of her key interviews was with Jeremiah Porter, Marguerite's son, who had inherited the general store after his mother's death. Porter, then in his 70s, recounted stories he had heard as a young man about Dr. Everdale. Folks said he was brilliant but strange, Porter told Reynolds. Came back from Philadelphia with fancy ideas and equipment. Set up practice here, but got more interested in his research than in treating patients. Started offering good money for certain types of folks, twins especially. Said he was conducting a medical study. According to Porter, Everdale particularly sought identical twins, preferably adults, often from impoverished areas where the offer of payment would be most attractive. He'd bring them to his property, supposedly for a few days of tests. Some left after a while, acting strange, not talking about what happened. Others never came back at all. During her investigation, Reynolds discovered something unexpected in the county records. Between 1871 and 1874, Dr. Ambrose Everdale had purchased unusual quantities of chloroform, ether, and various surgical implements from suppliers in St. Louis. More tellingly, he had ordered specialized restraints from a medical supply company that typically furnished asylum equipment. Even more compelling was what Reynolds found in the archives of the St. Louis Medical Society. Dr. Everdale had published several papers in obscure medical journals detailing his theories about what he called synchronous physiology in identical subjects. His writings proposed that twins shared more than just genetic material. They shared a kind of biological resonance that, if properly understood, could reveal fundamental truths about human consciousness. In one paper titled On the Conduction of Sensation Between Sympathetic Organisms, published in the short-lived Journal of Speculative Medicine in 1872, Everdale described experiments in which he claimed to have demonstrated that pain inflicted on one twin could be perceived by the other, even when they were separated by walls and unable to communicate. His final published paper, dated March 1873, included the disturbing hypothesis that this connection might be physically located in the hands, particularly the palms. He cited observed phenomena such as identical fingerprints, synchronized movements, and reported cases of twins experiencing sympathetic pain when one was injured. The hands, he wrote, represent not merely tools of manipulation but organs of connection, the physical manifestation of the sympathetic bridge between identical subjects. I propose that this connection can be isolated, studied, and potentially harnessed through careful surgical intervention. The paper concluded with a disturbing statement. I stand at the threshold of a discovery that will transform our understanding of human consciousness. The next phase of my research will demonstrate conclusively that identity exists beyond the boundaries of the individual body, that it can be extracted, transferred, and unified through the proper application of surgical technique. What happened to Dr. Everdale remains unclear. The last official record of him is a property tax payment in October 1874. After that, he simply vanishes from the historical record. Local stories suggest various fates, that he was driven off by angry townspeople, that he committed suicide when his experiments failed, or that he succeeded in whatever dark knowledge he sought and departed for unknown reasons. Professor Reynolds attempted to locate any living descendants of the Everdale family, hoping they might have preserved family papers or correspondence that could shed light on the doctor's fate. She traced the family line to Chicago, where Ambrose's nephew, Frederick Everdale, had established himself as a businessman in the 1880s. Frederick's granddaughter, Meredith Everdale Hayes, agreed to meet with Reynolds in 1957. According to Reynolds's research notes, Hayes was initially reluctant to discuss her great-uncle, stating that the family had deliberately distanced themselves from his legacy. Eventually, however, she produced a small collection of letters written by Ambrose to his brother, her grandfather, between 1870 and 1874. The letters confirmed much of what Reynolds had pieced together about Everdale's research interests, but also revealed something new. In his final letter, dated September 1874, Everdale wrote of a breakthrough. I have confirmed my theory. The connection exists and can be manipulated. What one experiences, the other knows, even without direct observation. Remove the hands, and the bridge between them remains, but control transfers to the operator. I have become the conduit. Hayes also showed Reynolds a family photograph from 1868, showing Ambrose Everdale as a young medical student. Reynolds noted in her research diary that Everdale had an unusual appearance, tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes, and unusually long, thin hands. Hayes mentioned that there had been twins in previous generations of the Everdale family, though Ambrose himself was not a twin. Most disturbing was a small object Hayes had found among her grandfather's possessions after his death, a pocket watch, its case made of tarnished silver, stopped permanently at 317. She had kept it as a family curiosity, unaware of its potential significance until Reynolds described the contents of the metal box found by the Sinclair twins. Reynolds' research came to an abrupt halt in December 1957 when a fire destroyed her office at the university, including most of her notes and collected materials. The only surviving documents were those she had stored elsewhere, primarily her interview transcripts and copies of the official records related to the Sinclair case. The fire was officially attributed to faulty wiring, though Reynolds herself apparently had doubts. In a letter to a colleague dated January 1958, she wrote, "The timing is too convenient to be coincidental. I had just begun to connect certain elements of the case that suggest a pattern extending beyond the Everdale and Sinclair incidents. Now those connections are lost, perhaps deliberately so." In her only published work on the subject, a brief article in the Journal of American Folklore titled "Sympathetic Ground, Landscape as Memory in Ozark Communities," Reynolds made no mention of Dr. Everdale's experiments or the fate of the Sinclair twins. Instead, she focused on how rural communities associate traumatic events with specific locations and how these associations shape behavior and land use for generations. After the article's publication, Reynolds reportedly refused to discuss her research further. She took a sabbatical in 1958 and subsequently transferred to Dartmouth College, where she shifted her academic focus to New England folk traditions. When contacted by other researchers interested in the Ozark cases, she invariably declined to share her materials or insights. A former graduate assistant, interviewed years later, recalled that Reynolds had become increasingly paranoid in the months before the fire, claiming that she was being watched and that her telephone was being monitored. The assistant also mentioned that Reynolds had developed an unusual habit. She would frequently examine her palms as if looking for something on the skin. In 1962, a graduate student named Daniel Corwin attempted to follow up on Reynolds' abandoned research. Corwin, described by colleagues as methodical and skeptical, was interested in the sociological aspects of the case. Specifically, how isolated communities maintain oral traditions and taboos across generations, without written records. He traveled to Iberia with the intention of interviewing locals and possibly visiting the former Everdale property, now overgrown after more than 2 decades as conservation land. His approach was thoroughly academic. In his research proposal, he specifically dismissed the supernatural elements of the local legends as rural myth-making, designed to reinforce community boundaries and justify collective decisions about land use. According to Corwin's correspondence with his faculty advisor, preserved in the university archives, his reception in Iberia was cool at best. Residents were unwilling to discuss either the Sinclair case or the Everdale legends. The county records office claimed to have no information about either matter, despite the documented evidence of their existence in Reynolds' earlier research. At the Iberia Public Library, Corwin discovered that all local newspaper archives from the relevant periods, the early 1870s and 1933-34, were missing, allegedly removed for preservation and never returned. The librarian, a middle-aged woman named Abigail Yates, possibly related to the Ephraim Yates who had encountered the Sinclair twins, suggested that Corwin would be better served researching something less sensitive to local feelings. Undeterred, Corwin located the conservation land that had once belonged to the Everdales and later the Sinclairs. His field notes describe a palpable atmosphere of neglect and isolation surrounding the property. The access road had long since been reclaimed by vegetation, requiring him to approach on foot through dense woodland. What Corwin found at the site was both less and more than he expected. The clearing was still visible, though smaller than described in historical accounts, gradually being reclaimed by the advancing forest. The creek had shifted its course slightly, eroding away the area where the Sinclairs' remains had been discovered. Of the cabin foundation they had begun, nothing remained visible. Corwin spent several hours at the site, taking photographs and soil samples, making sketches and notes. He reported no supernatural occurrences, no sense of dread or unease beyond what might be expected in an isolated woodland setting. His scientific approach seemed to have insulated him from whatever psychological influence the place might have exerted on more superstitious minds. It was only upon developing his photographs back at the university that Corwin noticed something unusual. In several images of the clearing, there appeared to be shallow depressions in the ground, roughly circular areas where the vegetation grew slightly differently than in surrounding areas. When he arranged the photos in sequence and marked these depressions, they formed a pattern, 2 parallel rows, each containing 6 circular areas approximately 4 feet in diameter. 12 depressions, 6 pairs. In his research notes, Corwin speculated that these might be the remains of old excavations, perhaps related to Dr. Everdale's activities or subsequent investigations. Alternatively, they might represent natural variations in the soil composition or drainage patterns. His scientific mind sought rational explanations, even as the pattern suggested something more deliberate. Corwin returned to Iberia the following month, this time equipped with more sophisticated equipment, including a metal detector and tools for extracting core samples. His plan, outlined in a research proposal submitted to his department, was to determine whether these depressions might correspond to burial sites or other subsurface features related to either the Everdale or Sinclair cases. He never completed this investigation. According to a brief report in the Jefferson City News Tribune dated May 17, 1962, Daniel Corwin was reported missing after failing to return from a research expedition in Miller County. His vehicle was found parked at a trailhead leading toward the conservation area. A 3-day search by local authorities failed to locate him or any evidence of his fate. The case was eventually classified as a presumed drowning, based on the theory that Corwin might have slipped while crossing the creek, which had been swollen by recent rains. His body was never recovered. Curiously, among Corwin's effects recovered from his vehicle was a small notebook containing his field observations. The final entry, dated the morning of his disappearance, included a sketch of his palm, showing a circular mark approximately the size of a dime. Beside the drawing was a single question: psychosomatic? The conservation land remained undisturbed for another 6 years. In 1968, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers conducted a survey of the area as part of a broader environmental assessment related to a proposed dam project. Among the team was geological engineer Victor Patel, who was assigned to take soil core samples from various locations within the conservation zone. Patel's technical report, filed with the Corps but never included in the final environmental impact statement, noted several anomalies in the soil composition of the clearing. Specifically, he identified areas where the natural soil horizons had been disrupted, indicative of prior excavation and refilling. These areas corresponded roughly with the depressions Corwin had photographed years earlier. More significantly, Patel's core samples from these areas contained traces of unusual mineral content, primarily iron oxides with traces of copper and zinc. While not unnatural in themselves, the concentration and distribution pattern was inconsistent with the surrounding geology. In his notes, Patel speculated that these metallic traces might be the result of decomposed man-made objects. The proposed dam project was eventually abandoned due to environmental concerns unrelated to Patel's findings. His report was archived along with hundreds of other technical documents, effectively buried in bureaucratic obscurity until 1984, when freelance journalist Moira Sullivan began researching a book on forgotten crimes of the Ozarks. Sullivan, a former crime reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, had become interested in cases that had fallen through the cracks of official history, murders, disappearances, and other crimes that had never been solved but continued to influence local communities through rumor and legend. Sullivan's investigation connected the various threads of the story: the Everdale experiments, the Sinclair twins' deaths, Reynolds' aborted research, Corwin's disappearance, and Patel's geological findings. Through persistent research and interviews with elderly residents of Miller County, Sullivan constructed the most complete narrative of events to date. Perhaps most significantly, Sullivan located Marguerite Porter's granddaughter, Evelyn Marsh, by then an elderly woman herself living in a nursing home in Columbia, Missouri. Marsh revealed that her grandmother had preserved both Howard Sinclair's journal and Dr. Everdale's journal until her death in 1965, at which point they passed to Marsh. Marsh allowed Sullivan to examine these documents firsthand, the first researcher to do so since Professor Reynolds in the 1950s. Sullivan's notes described the journals as physically unremarkable but psychologically devastating in their content. Dr. Everdale's later entries detailed his belief that twins shared a kind of metaphysical circuit that could be accessed and manipulated through their hands, specifically through a point in the center of the palm that he called the sympathetic node. His experiments had progressed from observation to intervention, culminating in the simultaneous amputation of his subjects' hands while they were conscious but sedated. According to these entries, Everdale discovered that by performing this procedure on twins simultaneously while they were seated back to back, he could create what he called a closed circuit of awareness, a state in which neither twin could distinguish their sensations from those of their sibling. More disturbing was his claim that by positioning himself between the twins during this process, he could insert himself into this circuit, experiencing their sensations and, eventually, influencing their thoughts. The removal of the hands, he wrote in August 1874, is not merely surgical but symbolic. By severing the physical manifestation of their connection, I transfer control of that connection to myself. I become the new conduit, the bridge between their separate consciousnesses, and through that bridge I can pass. The final pages of Everdale's journal contained detailed anatomical drawings of hands, focusing on the palms with intricate diagrams of what he believed to be the nerve pathways connecting the sympathetic node to the brain. These drawings were accompanied by notes in an increasingly erratic hand, suggesting that Everdale's mental state was deteriorating as his experiments progressed. Howard Sinclair's journal, particularly the entries from late October 1933, seemed to describe a similar process unfolding, though without Everdale's scientific framework. Howard wrote of moments when he couldn't distinguish himself from his brother, when Harrison's pain became his own, when thoughts entered his mind that he couldn't identify as his own. Sometimes I begin speaking, only to realize I'm saying words I don't intend, he wrote on October 28th. H. reports the same experience. It's as if a third mind is inserting itself between us, using our voices, our hands. The final pages of Howard's journal contained a map drawn in an unsteady hand. It showed the clearing on their property, marked with 12 X's arranged in a circular pattern. Beside this drawing were the words, "Where they sit, where we'll sit." Back to back to back to back to back to back. Sullivan's book manuscript, titled Sympathetic Ground, The Everdale Sinclair Cases, was completed in 1987 but never published. According to correspondence with her literary agent, found among her papers after her death in 1994, every publisher who reviewed the manuscript declined to publish it, citing various concerns about its commercial viability, questionable sourcing, or potential legal liabilities. One rejection letter from an editor at a major publishing house noted, "While Ms. Sullivan's research is impressively thorough, the central premise of the narrative, that the deaths of the Sinclair twins in 1933 were somehow caused by or connected to experiments conducted 60 years earlier, stretches credibility beyond what our nonfiction imprint can support. The suggestion of some kind of psychic influence persisting in a physical location for generations enters the realm of the paranormal, not documented crime." Sullivan herself seemed to anticipate this response. In her cover letter to publishers, she wrote, "I recognize that aspects of this case defy conventional explanation. I have endeavored to present the facts as documented, without speculation about supernatural causation, yet the pattern of events, spanning decades but centered on a single location, suggests connections that cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence." What happened to the journals after Sullivan's research remains unclear. Evelyn Marsh passed away in 1988, and her personal effects were distributed among distant relatives who had little knowledge of or interest in the family history. The journals, if they still exist, have not resurfaced in any public collection or private auction. The conservation land that once belonged to the Everdales and the Sinclairs was eventually incorporated into the Lake of the Ozarks State Park system. The specific area where the clearing once stood is now submerged beneath the artificial lake created by Bangyel Dam. Whether this inundation was intentional, a final attempt to bury a disturbing history, or merely coincidental, is a matter of speculation. What remains of this story are fragments scattered across various archives, personal papers, and local memories. The Everdale experiments, the fate of the Sinclair twins, the aborted investigations by Reynolds and Corwin, all exist now primarily as footnotes in broader histories of the region, if they're remembered at all. In 1997, a recreational diver exploring the submerged portions of the Lake of the Ozarks made an unusual discovery. At a depth of approximately 30 feet, in an area that local records suggested corresponded to the former Everdale Sinclair property, the diver found what appeared to be a man-made stone circle, approximately 8 feet in diameter. In the center of this circle was a copper box, similar to the one discovered by the Sinclair twins decades earlier. The diver, Marcel Trudeau, brought the box to the surface and opened it, finding it contained a single item, a human hand preserved through some unknown process, its skin leathery and dark with age. In the center of the palm was a circular mark like a brand or scar. Trudeau, disturbed by his finding, turned the box and its contents over to local authorities. The hand was sent to a forensic laboratory at the University of Missouri for analysis. The subsequent report indicated that the hand had been preserved using techniques consistent with late 19th century medical practice. DNA analysis was attempted but yielded inconclusive results due to the age and condition of the specimen. Before further tests could be conducted, the hand and its container were reported missing from the university laboratory. An internal investigation suggested a simple case of misplaced evidence, but no record of its current location exists. Trudeau himself became increasingly paranoid in the months following his discovery, claiming that he was being followed by someone who looks like a doctor from another time. In 1998, he was involved in a single-vehicle accident on Highway 54 near Osage Beach, when his car inexplicably left the road and struck a tree. He survived but suffered significant head trauma that affected his memory of the incident and, according to his family, altered his personality. In 2002, hydrologist Dr. Elena Vasquez conducted a comprehensive sonar survey of the lake bottom in the area where Trudeau had made his discovery. Her research was officially focused on sedimentation patterns, but colleagues reported that she had a secondary interest in locating the stone circle he had described. Vasquez's sonar images revealed something unexpected: a pattern of 12 circular depressions arranged in 2 parallel rows on the lakebed, each approximately 4 feet in diameter. These depressions were too regular to be natural features and corresponded to the pattern documented in Corwin's photographs from 1962. More disturbing was what the sonar detected beneath these depressions: anomalies in the substrate that Vasquez's report described as consistent with subsurface chambers or voids. The report recommended further investigation, but funding for the project was abruptly terminated before this could occur. Vasquez herself seemed disturbed by her findings. Colleagues reported that she became withdrawn and anxious, often examining her palms and complaining of a burning sensation. She took an extended leave of absence from her position at the Missouri Department of Natural Resources in 2003 and subsequently relocated to Arizona, where she reportedly refused to discuss her work at Lake of the Ozarks. In 2015, during an unusually severe drought, the water level of Lake of the Ozarks dropped significantly, exposing portions of the lakebed that had been submerged since the dam's construction in the 1930s. Local resident Emmett Holloway, whose family had lived in the area for generations, took advantage of the low water to explore areas near his property. On what would have been the former Everdale Sinclair land, Holloway discovered something protruding from the exposed mud, what appeared to be the corner of a metal box. Recalling the local legends, he chose not to disturb it, instead photographing it and reporting his finding to the Missouri Historical Society. By the time investigators arrived, rising water levels had once again submerged the area. Holloway's photographs, however, clearly showed what appeared to be a copper box, similar to those previously described in connection with the Everdale case. Holloway himself suffered a stroke 2 months after his discovery. During his recovery, he reported vivid dreams of pairs of people sitting back to back in a circle, their hands reaching toward a tall figure in the center. His wife noted that during these episodes, Holloway would examine his palms as if looking for something on the skin. The most recent development in this long, strange history occurred in 2018, when forensic anthropologist Dr. Marcus Reed conducted a comprehensive review of all available documentation related to the Everdale and Sinclair cases. His research was prompted by the discovery of a previously unknown autopsy report on the Sinclair remains found during the digitization of Miller County's historical archives. This report, apparently suppressed at the time by Sheriff Monroe, contained a detail absent from the official record. Both Sinclair brothers had unusual surgical modifications to the stumps of their wrists. According to the coroner's notes, the radius and ulna of each arm had been carefully shaped and the surrounding tissue arranged in a manner consistent with preparation for the attachment of prosthetic devices. No such devices were ever found, but the implication was clear. Whoever had removed the brothers' hands had intended to replace them with something else. Dr. Reed's analysis suggests a disturbing possibility that Dr. Everdale's experiments might have involved not just the removal of his subjects' hands, but their replacement with prosthetics of his own design, perhaps intended to allow him to somehow access or control the sympathetic connection he believed existed between twins. The historical record remains frustratingly incomplete. What actually happened on that isolated property in the Ozarks, first in the 1870s and again in 1933, may never be fully known. But in the small communities surrounding the Lake of the Ozarks, certain precautions are still observed. Local fishermen avoid certain coves where the water is said to be unnaturally still. Swimmers report unusual sensations, a tingling in the hands, a sense of being watched in areas near the former Everdale property, and occasionally someone will report seeing two identical men standing at the water's edge in the early morning mist, their arms ending not in hands but in smooth sealed skin. And sometimes, though this is only rumored, visitors to the area wake from troubled sleep to find a perfect circular mark on their palm, reddened as if burned, throbbing in time with their heartbeat. These marks always fade within days, leaving no trace except the memory of strange dreams. Dreams of sitting back to back with someone unseen, feeling what they feel, knowing what they know, while something else, something older and patient, stands between them, watching and waiting. Perhaps some secrets are best left submerged. Perhaps some ground, even beneath water, still remembers, and perhaps in the depths of the lake that now covers the place where the Everdale and Sinclair tragedies unfolded, 12 pairs of hands still reach upward, seeking connection, seeking completion, seeking to close a circuit begun almost 150 years ago. The Ozarks hold many secrets. This is merely one of them, a story of twin connections, medical obsession, and the persistent memory of a place that witnessed unspeakable events. Whether you believe in the supernatural dimension of this tale or prefer to see it as a series of tragic coincidences linked by human psychology and suggestion, one fact remains undeniable. Something happened on that land that continues to echo through time, rippling outward like the still waters of the lake, touching all who come too close to its dark center. As you listen to these words, perhaps you might glance at your own palms. Is that a slight redness in the center? A tingling sensation? A circular mark beginning to form? Or is it merely the power of suggestion, the mind creating what it expects to find? Either way, sleep well tonight. And if you dream of sitting back to back with someone you cannot see, of hands reaching toward you from darkness, remember, it's just a story, isn't it?